Welcome, everyone. So we'll be talking about building APIs with MVC 6 and OAuth. So it's from a perspective of something that I've been doing for the last 8 months. I've been working on building a public API for the company that I work for. So I'll take you kind of through the thought process and some of the problems that I've been facing along that way. Before that, though, I'm Filip Ekberg. For those of you that have not seen me speak before, I've been here a few times in Brisbane to do a few user group talks, and I went to DDD Brisbane last year, and it's always nice to come back here. So I work as a senior software engineer for a company called Invoice2Go. And before I go into that, I'm just going to start Camtasia. Sorry. So I work for a company called Invoice2Go, and we're building an invoicing application for iOS, Android, and for the web. So my role at Invoice2Go is taking care of our public API. And when building our public API, we've been looking at using the latest technologies from Microsoft. So that's pretty much what I'm going to focus on here today and take you through the thought process and some of these problems. If you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me during this talk or just ping me on Twitter afterwards. All right, so the agenda for the talk is pretty much starting off talking a little bit about ASP.NET, and I won't focus too much on what has changed in ASP.NET 5, but we'll talk about some of the things that you need to think about when setting this up with your continuous integration and continuous delivery. And then we'll spend a bit more time talking about OAuth and making sure that we can secure our APIs in a pretty much easy manner. And then we'll go on talking about how to consume these APIs. And not only consume the APIs from third-party applications, but also how do you make sure that these applications work when you're developing these apps locally. So you want to find out which tools you can use to test your APIs when you're building them on your machine. So using ASP.NET 5 has been a pretty interesting journey. About 8 months ago, they were in beta 4. They'd been working on ASP.NET for like a long time before that, but we felt that starting to build some software on ASP.NET 5 was a good place to start with that beta. So we started doing that, and when you want to introduce a beta version of something in your business, there's a lot of things that you need to think about, and you need to make sure that you mitigate the risks of crushing your entire business. So what's new in ASP.NET 5? Pretty much everything. They rewrote everything. It looks like ASP.NET 4 or 4.6. It looks very familiar, but they rewrote the entire stack. And what's pretty cool is that it's cross-platform. So Microsoft is heavily invested in making it possible to run ASP.NET 5 on Linux and OS X. You can pretty much don't touch any Windows machines at all and get your ASP.NET 5 apps running across all these different platforms. And what's both good and bad is that it's open source. So looking at traditional Microsoft, what they've done in the past is that they've built something for 1 or 2 years internally, and then they go ahead and release that, and it's pretty much well documented, it's well tested internally. They have their small group of people that test these applications and make sure that they work. But when it's open source, it means that all the bugs are out there, you can provide issues and comments on GitHub, and you pretty much work on a product that's always evolving. It's evolving in the open, and I found myself working with ASP.NET 5 and heading over to GitHub and reading an issue with like 1,000 comments. So what I mean about that is that there might be lack of documentation working with ASP.NET 5 now, but if we take all the GitHub issues and comments and transform that into like good MSD and documentation, we're probably bound to end up somewhere a lot better than we have in the past. The idea of ASP.NET 5 is that it's totally modular. So everything is a NuGet package. If you want to build an ASP.NET 5 application and you only want to serve static files, you can totally do that. You don't have to involve MVC. You don't have to involve any cookie authentication. You don't have to know anything about that. And that reduces the file size of your applications, and it makes it a bit, I'd say, harder to build apps, because you might not know which packages you need for something to work. I found myself working on things, and magically bringing in a NuGet package just solved all my issues. And I'm like, what happened? So it's both good and bad that everything is modular. You need to spend a bit more time researching what packages you need and how to get that incorporated in your application. And there's a lot more to ASP.NET 5. Since they rewrote everything from scratch, things have been renamed, things have been removed, and it's totally different, but still the same as the old one, if that makes sense. So using bleeding-edge technology is always interesting. When you introduce bleeding-edge technology in your business, you need to have kind of a plan of attack of how do I manage upgrades. What happens if we introduce ASP.NET 5 Beta 4, and then after a few weeks, the next beta version is out, and then the next one is out? You're going to spend a lot of time upgrading your application. I found myself doing a lot find of replaced upgrades. So I bring in the latest version of ASP.NET 5, and I open up my entire solution in Sublime and just do find and replace in all files. That's pretty much how I've gone through versions of ASP.NET 5. It's as easy as that. Because until something is RTM, there's no guarantee that things won't be renamed or things won't be removed. So if you're working with the latest technology, you have to expect that things will not look the same in a few months of time. What's even cooler with ASP.NET 5 is the promise of things running side by side. So imagine the idea of me working on a beta version of ASP.NET 5, and someone else on the team works on the latest RC version. Now, we can have these versions running on the same machine without installing any new frameworks. Because what happens when you publish ASP.NET 5 or work with it, you tell it which runtime you're targeting. And that runtime is simply a little folder on your computer. It's as easy as that. Now, working with the betas, that's been a promise, but I don't find it haven't worked that well. So I found myself having a few issues when going from beta versions, but now that it's in RC, I imagine this will be a lot more flawless, and it'll be a lot better. So one of the first things that I want to do when starting a new project, especially if it's a web project, it's easy enough to get that into TeamCity and Octopus if it's ASP.NET 4, for instance. But what about adding ASP.NET 5 to our CI and CD pipelines? I found myself writing too much PowerShell. I think I've written more PowerShell than I will ever want to do in my entire life again. So what I had to do, like what's good with TeamCity and Octopus is that they support you to write custom scripts for everything. So if there's no built-in support for the latest beta versions, you can always add that yourself. So here's an example of that PowerShell script. I got this from one of the Microsoft guys working on the ASP.NET 5 team. And what it's simply doing is that if we take a look at this first line here, or the second line rather, that's blue and blue. I hope you can see that. What it's simply doing is that it's restoring all the packages for the solution. It's telling it to not use the cache, because if you're upgrading between versions of ASP.NET 5, you want to make sure that you're downloading the latest packages. All too often, before I found out about that flag, I found myself restoring packages for an old beta version all the time. I'm like, why is my application not working? And then I want to do that in parallel. So they've redone the entire NuGet package restore as well. It's pretty cool that you can do this from command line. Now, the second thing that I had to do here was start looking for all the files in a certain folder that have a project.json in it, that doesn't contain this and this and this folder name. Just figuring this out took a few hours and getting it to work. But what's pretty cool here is that if we look at this final piece here, that's pretty much the magic of what happens here. So we're building our package. Then we are packing that up as a NuGet package, because everything in ASP.NET 5 is a NuGet package. So what I do is that I pack up my entire solution, or per project, and then I just shove that off to Octopus. That's pretty simple. Once you get the idea of how everything is working, you can start running a lot of PowerShell. So for continuous integration, I want to run all my tests. It's pretty much the same idea. I look through all my folders. I look for a folder name that ending with the name test. It's not perfect, but it enforces us to use that naming convention. And then I simply run the command dnext test. And that runs the test in that project. It's a bit different from how you've done this with, for instance, MS Build, or how you've done this with your old CI or CD pipelines. But working with bleeding-edge technology means that you might have to go out of your safe zone and work with some PowerShell. So one of the things that we found very important early on was that we want to be dogfooding. We want to be able to work with our APIs ourselves. It's really important that even if we're working on bleeding-edge technology and we're working with the latest and the latest, we need to educate the team on how to use that, and we want to use our own APIs. So the entire idea of bringing in ASP.NET 5 into an environment where we have legacy software that is proven is working is that we want to educate our teams. And we want to make sure that whatever we're building, we're using that ourselves. And the biggest benefit of that is that we can find pain points before our customers find them. So if I'm using my own API, if I'm telling my team members to build something on top of my API, and the first thing they ask is like, where's the documentation? Well, now I have to go and write one. Because how will they know how to work with my API if it's not well documented? So you'll find all these pain points, and you'll be able to work with this internally before you give access to your customers. And of course, it's important that you invite other team members in your business as well. So one of the things that I see in a lot of startups and a lot of other businesses is that they invite their employees to do hackathons. So they do internal hackathons to build on either new or old systems. They use the hackathons as a means to build something that is for the future. If it's cool enough, you might get to do that during your normal business hours. And it's something that the business might invest a lot of time in doing. So one of the things that we found really important early on was that we want to build this on top of our legacy systems. We don't want to go into a proven 1 or 2 year old solution and just upgrade that or rewrite that to ASP.NET 5, because that doesn't really make any sense. So it allows us to introduce this technology pretty early on. So we have this system that has been proven to work, and we have customers on it, and it's working well for them. But now we want to introduce ASP.NET 5 for our public API. So we can do that pretty easily by building this on the side of everything else. And that helps us upscaling our team members. It gives them a little bit of idea of what's coming in the future. Sure enough, things are going to change along the way since it's in beta, and then there's new beta versions, and then RC, and then RTM. Things are going to change along the way. But you can help educate your team and keeping them motivated. If they're working with old technology, it's a nice way to keep them motivated to work with something new as well. And it's mostly about mitigating the risk of introducing a totally new piece of software in an environment that is already proven to work, and just replacing everything with ASP.NET 5 Beta 4 wouldn't really make any sense. So instead, we build this as a little piece of software at the side of our current infrastructure. So let me show you how you go about building an ASP.NET 5 application. How many of you have seen ASP.NET 5 before? So about half. All right, so what it lets us do is that in Visual Studio, all I've done is I've created a new web project. This web project looks pretty similar to what we've seen before. There's a few things that are different compared to a normal ASP.NET 4.6 application. In this case here, we have our controllers, we have our models, we have repositories, and a few views. That all looks pretty similar. But then we have something else up here called root. That's where we store all our static files. And then we have a startup.cs down here at the bottom, which takes care of bootstrapping our application. So if you go into that, if we go down to the bottom, this is new in the RC, so if you haven't seen anything in the last couple of months, this will be pretty new to you. So we got this public static void main method that's pretty common in console applications. They're doing this to conform with .NET Core and all that, which is what lets us build cross-platform applications. But pretty much what it's doing is that it's setting up the entry point of our ASP.NET 5 application. It's telling us run this startup class. And if we go up here, we have something called configure, which configures the entire pipeline of our application. The idea with ASP.NET 5 is that we can inject things in the process of its processing requests. So for instance, I can say here that my application is going to use static files, which means that we can serve CSS files, I can serve static HTML files, I can serve JavaScript files. I can even use this as a file server. And then I'm simply setting up the normal routes for my application. I'm going to say that I'm going to use MVC for this application. That lets me set up and map my routes for the project, so I can set up like this default controller is home, the action is indexed, and there's an optional ID at the end. It all looks pretty similar, but it's also a bit different from how we've done this before. Now, if we take a look at the controllers, or run this application first and then look at the controllers, the first thing that you'll see here is that it now opens up a console for us. So this is the new Kestrel web server. It's supposed to serve a lot of requests compared to the old Cassini one, or IS Express. So what's pretty cool here is I can just copy this here. It's a feature in Windows 10. They finally made it possible to copy things and paste things into the command line easily. So I'm going to open this up in Edge without that part. Oh, come on. There we go. So this is just a normal ASP.NET 5 landing page. It looks pretty similar to the old one. And all this is doing is it's going through the normal pipeline request that you're pretty much familiar with. Goes into the home controller, returns a view, and then renders that. Now, what I wanted to do is that I wanted to add a new controller. I wanted to add a product controller. So I want this application to both be serving normal websites and also serving API requests. So the way that we've done this before is we could just do API-like things inside MVC, but we would probably go off and build a web API project. Now they've pretty much consolidated that, so it's capable of building everything here out of the box. There's no concept of doing MVC versus web API anymore. It's all just MVC. So I've introduced a product controller here, and as you see here on the top, I'm doing a pretty standard dependency injection. So I'm expecting here in my constructor to get an iProduct repository injected. In the past, you probably used AutoFac or something like that to inject this into your controllers. I'll show you how this is done as well in just a moment. And then you see here at the bottom, I have two actions. One called index async and one called index async that takes a parameter. Now, what's pretty cool here is if you're familiar with things like Nancy, you know that their routing is a bit different from mapping routes in the old ASP.NET. So in ASP.NET 5, pretty much like Nancy, you can use an attribute to define the routes to this specific action. You could even put this on top of the controller and say this is /API/products/ something else. But what's cool here is that I can map whatever I have in my route here to a parameter that I have in my action. So you see here that product ID maps to this integer here, and it just figures that out. So it gives us a nice overview of the routes that we have in the application, and we no longer have to do everything in the global ASACs or in the routes mapping. So that's pretty cool. So let me show you how I'm actually injecting this iProduct repository into the controller, because it's just working out of the box. And if I go back to the startup file, there's another section in here called configure services. What this lets us do is configure things that we need to run our application, configure all the services that we use in our application. And what I'm doing here is I'm registering a transient, which is a short-lived object. I'm saying map my iProduct repository to the concrete implementation of my product repository. So now if I head over to the browser again, and I do /API, and then the controller name, and then just hit enter, it gives me all of these items here. And I can even go ahead and do /2, for instance. See that I get a Lumia 930 for $299, and of course, the latest Lumia is a bit more expensive. So we see here that it's pretty easy for us to build something using ASP.NET 5. It's pretty familiar, but at the same time, they've redone the entire backend of this, and working with the middlewares instead of setting everything up that you've done in the past is a bit different. But once you get a hang of that, it's pretty easy, and it pretty much forces you to build your software using good practices. So let's switch gears a bit and talk about OAuth. How many of you are familiar with OAuth? It's a bit more than half. All right, so hopefully I'll be able to teach you something new here about OAuth and some of the pain points that you have to go through when introducing OAuth in your applications. So we'll talk about OAuth and how that applies to APIs and what the difference is between setting up your own OAuth server versus using a third-party OAuth server. Before I go into that, I just want to do a short disclaimer. I'm by no means a security expert. Everything I say here may be totally wrong, and I take no responsibility for your applications not working properly. So I would like to tell you to consult a security expert if you're introducing this in your applications. Have someone do penetration testing both from the inside of your organization and from the outside. Make sure that if you're building a critical part of your business and using OAuth or applying these security measures yourself, make sure that it's properly done and that it's not hackable, at least not easily. Right? So with that out of the way, what about Twitter and Facebook and other OAuth providers? often when you mention OAuth, people immediately think, OK, so someone needs Twitter to log into my application. In a lot of cases, that's true. But what that does is that it lets us rely on a third party. And I don't like relying on third parties more than pulling in a NuGet package. I don't want to send my users off to Twitter to be able to log into a third party. So the idea here is that when we built our public API at Invoice2go, we wanted people to be able to build apps on top of our software, but we don't want them to force their users to go and sign up for Twitter. We want them to be able to log in to their Invoice2go account on the third party, and that means that we have to host something on our end. And avoiding using Twitter and Facebook and other OAuth providers out there, I'd say that it gives less headache to the third-party integrators, because they don't have to worry about their customers rejecting them due to the lack of a Twitter or a social media account. It could, of course, be added as an option. So I could say that when you register for our service, you can also sign up using Facebook or Twitter, but it's not going to be the central part of our API. You're not required to use any of these OAuth providers to log into the app, but it could be added as an option, because sometimes it's nice to have everything in one place. Signing to Twitter everywhere would be awesome, except if your Twitter account gets compromised, it's not so awesome anymore. So Reagan here, for instance, they do this. They let you both sign in using Twitter, Facebook, GitHub, and so forth, and they let you sign up as well. So would you roll your own OAuth implementation? How many of you think that I'm going to suggest you build your own security framework? One? Really? No. How about we don't do that? So how about we use a software that's proven to work, and it's built by people that know what they're doing? When I add security to my old ASP.NET projects, I don't go and write the entire cookie authentication myself. I pull in a package, and I rely on someone at Microsoft that has a security background that built everything securely. Right? So we're going to rely on a product called Identity Server. How many of you have heard about Identity Server? Oh, wow. About half of you have heard about that. That's great. So it's built by industry experts. It's a framework for adding OAuth capabilities to our projects. It's open source. And as I mentioned before, being open source is both good and bad. The good thing about something security-wise being open source means that there's a lot of eyes on it. Of course, there's been products in the past that have gone open source, like I think TrueCrypt went open source, and that's like 1 million lines of C code that no one can read. But in this case here, Identity Server is written in .NET. It's written by security experts. There's a lot of people from Microsoft that help out and contribute and look through their code base. And there's a lot of third-party people making sure that this is actually built properly. And what Identity Server lets us do is they let us use both OAuth and OpenID Connect. And we'll talk about these differences in a little moment. But they pretty much, people tend to just smash them together and say, let's do auth. What's good about this being open source as well is that the guys behind Identity Server put a lot of effort into making good samples. There's a sample repository on their GitHub page that lets you browse through all the different scenarios that you can think of. And most of the demos that I'm doing here today is based on top of their demos. So when you go back and check out their repo, you will find yourself familiar with that and the common terminologies and the code patterns that we're using. So before we can talk about introducing OAuth, I need to spend some time talking about tokens. So a token is something that you're given to prove that you have permission to get some data. So if I give this thing here to someone as a token, you can give that to anyone, and when they get back to me with this token, they can ask me anything they want. And I can validate that this is a valid token. I can make sure that no one tampered with this. At least that's the promise. So you'll hear me talk about tokens and codes, and they all have their particular piece in this entire workflow. So the first thing you'll hear me talk about is authorization codes. Authorization codes is a way for you to trade a little piece of code for a token. And we'll get more into why you would do that later on. It's used for a specific OAuth scenario. But pretty much, think of an authorization code being alive for 15 days. So you have 15 days to request access to my API. So you can trade that for an access token. Now, an access token could be something that you can trade for your data. It could be private data, it could be user-specific data, it could be public data, but we want to know that you're accessing this type of data. So it's something that lets you access a given resource. And tokens are generally, or the access tokens, they're generally short-lived. So you'll end up having maybe 30 to 60 minutes long-lived tokens. So you have 15 days to request one of these access tokens, and once you've done that, you have 30 minutes to use it, then it's going invalid. So how do you make sure that your API or your third-party app can still access the API? Introduce a third type of token. Introduce something called a refresh token. The refresh tokens lets us keep our access token fresh. It's pretty much like the access code, but the refresh tokens are normally living for a bit longer, maybe 30 to 45 days. So after 15 minutes, you could just send off the refresh token and get new access to the API. And of course, that also delivers a new refresh token. So you'll be able to always keep your data updated. You can always integrate with the API as long as the third-party user don't reject your access. So what happens when I give this to someone as an access token, it's really hard for me to say that token is no longer valid. It's really hard to me to pull that back. But I can refuse you access to get a new one. So what about storing the tokens? So we have these access codes, we have the access token, we have the refresh tokens. How do we store them? Well, since they can pretty much give you access to private user data, you should really treat them like passwords. Now, don't go and hash them, because that pretty much makes them useless. So you could encrypt them, you could store them somewhere. I'm not going to suggest where you do that, but you can store them wherever you want. Just make sure that you don't give your token to anyone, and that you might want to avoid, if you have an application on the web, you might want to avoid having that token inside JavaScript or anything like that, because potentially, if you're not on HTTPS, anyone could steal your token. So remember that it gives you access to potentially private data. You want to make sure that you don't just give anyone access to your APIs or your users' data. Because if you do, you're not going to have any more users. So tokens are also pretty much known as JWTs, at least when we talk about identity server and OAuth. A JWT is simply a JSON Web Token. It's just a way for us to include a payload of information, like claims that include scopes and user information. So think of this like you get a chunk of data, and this data here is signed by some private certificate that makes sure that no one tampered with this token. And this is passed back and forth with the OAuth server and the API that we're invoking. So there's a cool tool called jwt.io that lets us inspect this token. I'll show you that in a little bit here. What happens if you don't validate your token? So I mentioned there's a signature in the token that tells us if someone tampered with that. Imagine I give this token to someone, and there's a flag saying that I'm an administrator. Now, if I don't validate that someone didn't tamper with this, anyone could make anyone administrator, and that could be quite devastating for our software. So we want to make sure that even though that our server might validate the token, also make sure that you do that on the client side. And we want to build our software assuming that token expires. Imagine that we are calling an API that is rate limited. Maybe you wouldn't rate limit an API a lot in 2015, because we can pretty much scale out anything. And if we have the problem of a lot of people using the API, that's pretty much a good problem. But rate limiting is a good practice to start off with, especially when you're introducing a new API, because you can pretty much limit, if there's a problem, you can just turn everything off really quickly without just shutting the servers down. So build your softwares as a third party, expecting that the tokens will expire and that they are expired. So you can validate the lifetime of your token locally in your third-party application. So before you go ahead and talk to the API, you can make sure that you just refresh that, because otherwise that call will be rejected. So let's have a quick look at jwt.io and how to inspect a token. So this here is pretty much what an access token will look like when the OAuth server delivers that to you. It looks pretty confusing. It's divided in 3 parts. There's another dot in here somewhere. There we go. So it's divided by 3 dots. The first part up here is the header of our token. it tells us which kind of algorithm was used to sign this token. And then in the middle here, we have the payload. It includes your roles and scopes. It includes information about who you are as a user. And then at the bottom here, we have the signature, which validates that this is who you are and you did not tamper with this token. Now, it's all base64 encoded. So I could take this part here and write a bit of C# code to decode that into a JSON string. I could change it and then encode it back. And then I could try and invoke the API, but the signature would be wrong. Now, we can inspect this using a tool that I just mentioned called jwt.io. So if I just paste this token here, you'll see that it includes the header, which tells us about the algorithm and token type. We get the payload data, which includes who issued this, who is the issuer. This is the OAuth server, and this is the audience. And then we have an expiry. We have which client, which is a third party, who invoked this, and who requested access and got this token issued. And then we get information about the scopes, which means that I can read things from the API. We could have a lot of different scopes in here telling us what we can do with this token. We get the user ID, we get some roles, and then the type of grant that we use when getting this token. So there's a lot of information in here. And then, of course, at the bottom, we could verify the signature by adding the private and public keys. But we won't do that. OK? So you see here, as well as they divide this up in 3 pieces. So that's what I said. It's the header, it's the payload, and it's the signature at the bottom. And if I start changing things in here, I could, for instance, change read here to write. And you'll see here that it's going to say the signature is now invalid. We're not going to give you the access token, because we don't want to be helping you hack APIs. So if you want to do this, you have to try this in some other tool. But basically, you could also add your keys in here and reissue this token with this information. So you could rechange the signature or re-sign the token to make sure that it now lets you use the new data. So think about that for a second. If I can change my tokens, it means that the key that I have on the server to sign the token, that's something that you don't want to give to anyone. You might want to do that for your dev boxes. That could be shared among your dev team. But the key that you're using in production, if that leaks, anyone could change anything on your tokens. And they could potentially access anything on your API. That could pretty much be devastating. OK. So how do we go now about securing our API? We've talked about the tokens. We've talked about not using Twitter and Facebook or Google or GitHub as an OAuth provider. We've seen a little bit about how to set up ASP.NET 5. But now we want to append some auth to this. We need to first choose the OAuth flow that we want to use for our applications. There's a bunch of different OAuth flows out there. And I'm just quickly going to go through a few of them. There's one called authorization code and implicit flow. Remember before I talked about that you can create an authorization code for a token? With that flow, you're also allowed to refresh your tokens whenever you want. The idea behind an implicit client is that the tokens is short-lived. It's like a single-page application, and you could refresh that in another manner. But the idea of an authorization code is that your application is offline. So I've just included the flows here, a few flow diagrams. They look pretty complex, but they're really not. You have your resource owner, which could be me as a third-party user. I ask for access to a third party. They send me off to the OAuth server. I get back with a token when they've validated my credentials. And the same goes for the implicit flow. Then we got another flow called resource owner password. This is where you trade your username and password for access to my API. Looks a lot more simpler, doesn't it? Imagine that you go to a third party and they ask for your username and password. What's the first thing you do? You pretty much close the browser, because you don't want to give your username and password to anyone. So this flow here is pretty much only for trusted third parties that you want to ask for username and password. It could be internal applications. It could be that I'm building a Windows Phone application on top of our public API. And since I'm building the API myself, I can trust myself to ask for the username and password, because I know how it's going to be handled. So pretty much what happens here is that you you send off your username and password to the authentication server or the authorization server. It gives you back a token. It's pretty simple. There's an even more simpler flow than that. Imagine a third party that needs to perform some actions on your API without knowing your identity. So for our public API, for instance, we want to be able to let people create accounts over the API. But they don't have a user yet. So they need a way to invoke the API and invoke certain endpoints without user-specific access. So the way that we can do that is by sending off the client credentials. Each third-party application is built up by a client ID and a secret. You can trade those for an access token as well, which gives you a limited access to certain scopes in the application. And one thing that we wanted to do when we were introducing ASP.NET 5 and OAuth, they're pretty new concepts, and building on top of these technologies together, we wanted to leverage our current infrastructure. We didn't want to rebuild the entire user database. We wanted to make sure that if you're already logged into our current system, it should be a seamless experience. You should be able to go to the app and still be logged in. So if we already are authenticated, we want to make sure that we are checking that in something called a pre-authentication in the identity server workflow. So what you can do when it's checking if you're logged in, if you can check if there's a specific cookie, if the user is from a specific network or something like that, and then you can just skip the entire login screen and say, like, hey, this user is logged in, I know who they are, here's the token that you can use to access their data. Now, if you have to log in, you can still call internal APIs if you like. So what we do is that you're prompted with a new login screen for the OAuth or authorization server, but that goes ahead and talks to our internal authentication as well. So we're using the same user credentials across the entire business. That gives the end users a seamless experience, and it's a lot less headache for us. So I've talked about authentication and authorization, and they sound pretty much the same. A lot of the time, you see people just take out the end of these words and just say auth, which pretty much incorporates both of them. So the difference is that authentication is the process of asserting that somebody is really who they say they are. So it's pretty much like I'm providing my username and password. I'm proving that I am this person. While authorization refers to the rules that determine who is allowed to do what. For instance, Filip is allowed to create and delete databases, while Josh is only allowed to read data. So it's more about who you are and what permissions you have. So you use your login and password to authenticate, and you get permissions to access something. So the way that we can see this is that authentication gives you your identity. That's OpenID Connect. Authorization, that's OAuth. That gives you permissions to something. So the way that OAuth and OpenID Connect work together is that they're providing us with a lot more than just saying, OK, you can access this resource. Of course, you go ahead and go to your OAuth server or authorization server. You log in, which is an authentication. But then when you get back to the third party, you have two options. Either the third party knows who you are, as well as what you can access, or they only know what you can access. So when you're bringing OpenID Connect into the picture, they will also get information about your identity and as well as your permissions. And what's good is that Identity Server provides this out of the box. So they let us use both OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect. And the difference between OAuth 1.0 and 2.0 is that they've changed pretty much everything in OAuth. They added a lot of flows, and they made a lot of changes to the spec, which is another thing you'll find yourself doing a lot. If you're building things on top of OAuth, you'll find that you have a third monitor with the spec open all the time, because you need to learn the process and understand what happens. It's pretty good. So I'd like to show you how to secure our API and pretty much how easy it is to do that. I have this same application that we saw earlier. I've got my products controller. And pretty much the only thing that I want to do here in the products controller is to add the authorized attribute on top of the controller. That's what we are used to when building APIs. I append this authorized attribute, And then somehow we know that the user is now authorized to access this resource. So how do I make sure that the users are authorized and logged into my system? We need to set up a new application. I have another web application here at the bottom, which is simply a new application that is hosting OAuth for us. So I'm calling this demo2.oauth, and all I've done, well, there's a few things that I've done, but the first thing I did was to bring in a few packages. You'll see here that I brought in a package called identity server, as well as a package called identityserver.integration.ASP.NET. These two packages are pretty much the only thing you need to take into your project to make sure that you can set up identity server. So if we go into the startup file now, you'll see that there's a few things that changed in here as well. If we look at the configure method here, we'll see that we have a few things. Let me just do this. So first of all, we have a certificate here at the top, which is used to sign our tokens. We're pointing to a PFX file, which is simply a certificate file, to say, use this file when we are signing our tokens. Okay? And then we're setting up a few identity server options. For instance, I'm setting up a factory. This factory pattern lets us set up things for user management, for scope and client management, and so forth. All I'm doing here is I'm using in-memory patterns. So I've got static classes with static lists with clients, scopes, and users. You could imagine, though, that you can set this up pointing to SQL Server, pointing to a document database, pointing to something else. You could really extend this as you like. And then I'm simply setting this signing certificate up here at the bottom. I'm saying I don't care about if this is SSL or not, because I'm running this on localhost. And then what's left here at the bottom is that I'm saying that I'm going to use identity server. So now this new ASP.NET 5 project that I set up here, I set up my middleware or my pipeline to configure the identity server. So now what I can do is that I can hook this up with my ASP.NET 5 application or my API, so it can leverage this OAuth server as a protection around the API. At least that's the idea. Okay? So if we go ahead and look at our ASP.NET 5 application here, the demo that we looked at before, I added the authorize attribute, but now I need a way for us to say, hey, I'm going to use identity server. I'm going to use something to protect my API using OAuth. So we do that in the startup project, the startup file as well. If we scroll down here to the bottom, you'll see here that there's a few things in here. Oops, sorry. Here we go. So first of all, I've set up that I'm using JWT security token handler, which pretty much just prepares this for using a JWT. And then I'm saying, OK, I'm going to use a bearer token. I'm going to use a JWT bearer token, and here are the options for that middleware. I'm going to point to this URL, which is our OAuth server running locally. I'm going to say that I don't care about SSL for now, but once you're in production, you want to make sure that you don't have this. And I'm also configuring the audience, and I'm saying just challenge this automatically. Make sure that everything is OK. I don't want to do anything manually. Just handles all the cookies and everything for me. And that is pretty much it. So now if I run this application, it's going to run both of the projects. Just need to close the old one first. You see here that I have two servers running. And the API here is on this port here. So I'm going to copy that. And before I refresh this page here, I'm going to open up the network debugging tools here. I'm going to press F5, and you'll see here that hopefully there's no data shown here. And it's saying that we are now unauthorized to view this page. So at least we added security to know that we don't have any access. That's pretty good. OK? So before I tell you how to consume that and how to retrieve a token, let's just talk about consuming these types of APIs before we do that. So we can test the APIs in a few different ways. You might want to test these locally before you push this to production. You can use a tool called Postman. How many of you are familiar with Postman? Almost everyone. It's one of my favorite tools, pretty much. Like, I use this all day. We've set up like a team account so we can sync all our settings and all our endpoints. And then we have all our environments set up in Postman as well. So if something's running locally or in production, I can try and hit that and set up scenarios for that. It's pretty amazing. So what do I need to get a token? What do I need to now invoke my API and make sure that I'm authenticated instead of getting this 401 error? We need to know the client ID. That's something that we're given when we're setting up our third-party application. I need to know the client secret. That could be something that we issue, or it could be something that the third party decides themselves. We need to know which scopes you want to access. I didn't show you the scopes file or the user file or all the other in-memory stuff, but you can pretty much set up any scopes that you want. You could say, I want access to your identity, I want access to your email, I want access to read and write, and so forth. And for certain flows in OAuth, like the implicit and authorization code flow, you're going to be redirected from a third party to our secure OAuth server. So remember that I said before that you don't want to enter your username and password at a third party. What happens when you go to the third party is that they redirect you to our secure server. You enter your username and password in our server, and then we use this redirect URL to redirect you back to that client. So that also means that the client itself, they need to send this off when they do the OAuth request, because we need to verify that they really are who they say they are. And we need to know which kind of grant you're using. You can use password grant, or you can use authorization code or implicit. So we need to know which type of grant we're going to look at, and if that's allowed for your client. Depending on the flow, you might send off your client credentials, you might send off the authorization code, you might send off resource owner's username and password. So that's the flow that we're going to use. We're going to look at using the resource owner password for token retrieval. So as I mentioned before, we can use the username and password to trade that for a token. And it's pretty simple. I'm going to hit the URL, and it's going to return some JSON looking like this here. So we have the access token, we have the expiry, which is, I think that's an hour, and we have which type of token it is, which is in this case, we're using something called a bearer token. That's the default token that you use with the authorization headers. And then we get a refresh token as well, which is pretty good, because that means that we can keep our token alive. So how do we use this? I got the token. How do I now use this to call my API? It is pretty simple. Like, it's probably simpler than anything else we've looked at. You just add an authorization header to your calls to the API and say that, hey, this is my bearer token, and here's the token itself. And now the API will know that this token is valid for you to use. So remember, we set up in the API, we set up where the OAuth server lives and who the audience is and so forth. When the public API or the API itself sees this token, it's going to validate the signature. It's going to go off and ask the OAuth server if it's still valid. So there's a lot of things happening in the background to make sure that no one tampered with your tokens. So let's have a look at how we can get data from the API. So first, let's go into Postman. I've set up this post request here, which is simply posting data to /connect/token. I'm providing this with a client ID, secret, the scopes that I want, the grant type that I'm using, which is password, and then the username and password, which is Alice and Alice. And now if I execute this here, you'll see here that I got the token here at the bottom. I could also, as you saw in my sample in the slides, I also got a refresh token. The way to get a refresh token is that you need to ask for the scope called offline access. That's really important to remember. So if I want to get a refresh token, I simply had to add offline access here. And if that's allowed for the client, which in this case it's not, I would get this is an invalid scope. Okay? So let's go ahead and get that token again. I'm going to copy this. And then I'm going to do a call to product/all and basically just set this as an authorization header like we saw before. I'm going to replace this here with my new token. And invoke that URL, and I got some data. If I remove the authorization header and try to invoke this again, it's going to tell us that it's unauthorized. So we pretty much validated that this worked. I can also change this one here. Let's just change one letter and see what happens. Hopefully it's going to say internal server errors, because there's no way for it to validate the token. So that's an invalid token. You probably want to handle the 500 errors and so forth, so you filter out the errors that you send back to your clients. So another way that we can consume our API is by building an application, and that's pretty much what we want to do now. We want to look at building a third-party application, and what I've done here is that I've set up this application. I've set up a web project. It's all in the same solution. That doesn't really matter. We have this same API. I have the controller, which is products. I have my authorization server. If we take a look at the clients in here, you'll see here at the bottom that I have an MVC6 demo client. It's using the implicit flow, which means that we're going to get redirected to the authorization server, where we can enter our username and password. I have a URL that I'm going to be redirected to. And then I can also be redirected to another URL once everything is done. Okay? So if we take a look at the web app, because the API and the authorization server, they pretty much look the same. It's all in memory. It's all using the same authorization headers. And if I go into the web project, all I've done here is setting up a new ASP.NET 5 project. It looks pretty clean. I've just added a controller and a view. And I've added a reference to the OAuth server. So if we head into the startup file and scroll down to the configuration section in here, you see here that I'm setting up use cookie authentication. I'm setting up use OpenID authentication. I'm saying you're going to use this authentication scheme. You're going to point to this authority, which is our OAuth server. We don't care about HTTPS. Here's the client ID. We're going to ask for an identity token and a normal token. The identity token gives us information about the user's personal details, like full name and address and whatnot, if you want that, which is what OpenID lets us do. And then we are also requesting the OpenID email and API1 scope. So these two here, they're built into OAuth. So both OpenID and email, they're standards in OAuth. You can request these scopes, but the API1 scope looks a bit different. That looks like a custom scope. So if we head into our scopes file here for our configuration for OAuth, you'll see that we're using standard scope.openid. We have the profile, email, and then at the bottom here, we have API1. I could add totally different scopes in here for like reading access, write access, and so forth, or beta access, whatever you can think of. So if all that's what I've added, let's have a look at our home controller. I've used the authorized attribute here as well, which means that we need to have the normal cookie present that tells us that we're logged into the app. Notice how I added the use cookie authentication as well. That's for being authenticated with our local application, which will, if we're not, send us off to the authorization server, request an access token, and then store that locally in the token for the user. Then you can use that to communicate with the API. So once we're logged in, once we've redirected back to our application, we can use the token, which we can find by doing user.findFirst, which lets us find a specific claim. So a claim is something that is present in that payload that we saw in the access token. So in this case here, the user's credentials that we have in our cookie for our web app includes the access token that we use to talk to the API. So when I have that, I can simply do an HTTP call by setting the bearer token to that token, simply doing the same type of request that we saw before. Let me just do this here so you can see that better. So we do a call to /API/products. I'm sending off the bearer token, and then I'm just deserializing that to a product model that I have in this local web project. Super simple. If I run this here, I need to close the web service first. So now I should be able to hit this website. So it should be on, let's verify that. We can go into project.json and have a look at which URL we've set this up to. So you'll now notice here when I hit this site, hopefully I'm not logged in on my local machine. If I am, I just have to open this up in incognito. Let's see if this is doing anything. There we go. So you see here that what's also cool with Kestrel is that we're getting so much logging into these consoles. So when I'm running these apps locally, we get so much information here, like it's so much. So I can go ahead now, I'm at the authorization server. You'll see here at the top, it's the port 9300. It's using this signing token. So it got redirected to the authorization server. The authorization server set a few things up and redirected us back to this page here. So now I can log in here. I'm at the secure server hosted by us, right? So I can do Alice. I don't care about if you know my password. I do log in, and look here at the top. Hopefully, right. So it asked me for permissions first, because I haven't said to remember that. It told me now that, do you want to give access to this third party? So the third party requests access to your data. Before we can give it access to that data, we need to say, OK, it's fine for you to access my data. We could also set up the identity server to never show this screen and always allow you to access the data. So it's pretty much up to you. But I like to give explicit grant to what you can access. So now look at the top here. We're redirected back to the website. It's called the API. And what's pretty cool here is that we got the name, which is Alice Smith. And I promise this is not hard-coded, because I'll show the view here. We know that it's DDD1, Lumia 930, and Lumia 950. That's all coming from the API. So it's doing that by first authenticating with the authorization server, then calling our API that is protected by the OAuth server, and then we're telling our third-party web app that it's going to use both of them, and it's just magically going to work together. So I'll just show you real quickly here that I don't cheat. If this wants to open up. So you'll see here that we can call user.first, and we can get the name, products for a name, and then we're using the product model that we deserialized from the API call. So it's all working pretty well. So we saw here that it's pretty easy for us, or it's fairly easy to set something up that works locally as a small demo. But then when you start working with this in a real scenario like we did, you want to make sure that you replace the in-memory users and scopes and clients with real storage. You store that in, for instance, SQL Server or whatever storage you prefer. But it's so easy for us to get started with both ASP.NET 5 and getting OAuth on top of that. So finally, I'd just like to talk a little bit about scopes. So we've seen that I could add the API 1 scope, and I could add custom scopes to my application. So what I want to do is I want to add support for a new scope. I want to say, whenever I see the write access scope, I want to be able to say that you're only authorized to communicate with this action or this URL whenever we see that scope present. So how do we do that? Of course, it's also simple enough. If we head into that demo, I'll show you. It's pretty much the same setup that we had in earlier. We have the web app or the API here. If we go into the controller of products, all I've done here is that I've added a new post down here at the bottom. You'll see here that it's now requesting that you have the scope write added. And then, of course, it's going to ask for a product from the body, and then it's going to return 201 created once that's done. It's really important when you're building APIs to return the correct status codes, because if you do 200 OK for everything, I bet you your third-party developers will be mad. So how do we set this up? The first thing I need to do is to tell my API that you can look for this type of scope inside a claim. The way that we do that is by going into Startup, and I'm adding a few authorization options here. So I'm setting up a policy for both read and write. So you need read access to access any data out of the API, but then you can optionally have this scope write as well. And it's going to find this in our bearer token. Super simple, right? And you just have to configure that in your middleware in ASP.NET 5. And there's one thing that we changed in the OAuth server, and that's just adding these types of scopes and making sure that we have these both scopes added to the API. So I have the scope right here. And if I just close off those here, and then I rerun these applications, I'll go into Postman. I'll ask for a token for only read for now. I'll click send here, and we should be getting a token here at the bottom. I'll copy this token here. I'll go into another setup that I've done here. I'm going to post this body here that's going to create a new product. But before I can do that, I need to set the authorization header. So I'm going to set that to only allow me to do a create. We'll just replace this here. So now that I run this here, hopefully it's going to tell us that it's forbidden. We're not allowed to do that because you don't have access. It's not telling us that you're not authorized. It's just telling us that the resource you're trying to access, you have not any rights to do so. Really simple fix for doing that. We simply go back to this here, and we ask for the right scope. Now I got a new access token. I'll use this. I'll just replace this part here. And now we get a 201 created instead. Super simple. So we simply added and leveraged scopes inside our API. Question?
So are you saying that that scenario, what you could do is having auth authenticated through an API consumer, as the API consumer, you could actually temporarily find a way to elevate based on a click or an action by your user to gain the right privilege, ask for that refresh token, and then do that activity using that right privilege, called the elevated privilege, and then drop back down again by then issuing another token without the right in the scope.
So you're asking if you can temporarily elevate access privileges by doing one thing, asking for write access, and then going back to read access. You can sure enough do that. But you would probably ask for all of the scopes at once. And the thing that you do is, when you got redirected to the OAuth server to log in, it asks me for permissions to what I can access. Oh, this is not plugged in. Where do we have, sorry. I'm just going to plug this in so it doesn't go dead. Whew. All right, so you know when you got redirected to that screen in the beginning, or the OAuth screen where you log in, it also asks you to give permissions to the scopes that you've asked for access to. So you'd have to redirect your third-party users to that screen again and have them re-authenticate and then approve your access to write. But in this case here, I'm trading my username and password for access to both read and write. So you want to set that up in the start, but depending on how you're building your apps, you could temporarily increase your access. Okay, so let me just finally wrap up here. We saw that it's super easy for us to apply OAuth in our applications. And we saw that it's super easy for us to work with ASP.NET 5. Even though a lot has changed, it's coming to a state where it's pretty easy for us to work with. So ASP.NET 5 is now open source. It's a go-live license as they release the RC. So that means that Microsoft is now officially supporting you if you have problems in production. And it's cross-platform. You can build ASP.NET 5 on your Mac and then publish that to Linux or Windows. Building secure APIs means that we don't want to roll our own security frameworks. Use something like Identity Server to give people access to your APIs, and build that on top of your legacy systems. Read the OAuth 2 specification if you're going to work with Identity Server, because it's really going to help you understand the different flows and how everything fits in place. I've gone through a lot of different things here and a lot of terminology and samples here today, but it really takes time understanding all these small parts of this as well. So I'd really recommend just having the OAuth spec open on a second monitor. So you need to know your flows for OAuth. It's important to understand the distinction between authentication and authorization. And we want to be able to leverage our claims. Like we saw here in the last demo, I can change a scope to read and write and then give you access to different parts of my API or my application. So if you want to introduce new and shiny tech, build that on top of legacy systems, mitigate the risk, and help educate your developers. Start with non-mission critical parts of your business. Like we did, we built a public API using these latest technologies, which lets us educate our team members and use new and shiny technology while we still have our legacy system working really well in the background. If you want to download the code that I've done here, you can go to bit.ly/DDD-OAuth, and you can download that there. And the slides are hopefully going to be available afterwards as well, if you want to take a look at that. I want to thank our sponsors. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to be here today. So really take a moment to appreciate their support for this event. Thanks a lot for listening to me. If you have any questions, just come up to me afterwards.